Hello, and welcome to today's discussion on data trends and best practices brought to you by Insight. My name is Jessica Ostring, Marketing Specialist here at Insight, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This discussion is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during today's discussion, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. All questions will be captured. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. The help guide covers common technical issues. I would now like to turn over this presentation to our presenters, Chris Kapusta, Clay Heuckendorf, and Mike Mclain. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thanks, Jessica. So good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Kapusta. I'm a senior manager in our data infrastructure management practice. I'm joined today by two, I'll call them SMEs, but that's not doing it justice, from our data protection practice. So Clay, I'll let you introduce yourself and then kick it over to Mike.
Hey, good morning, guys. Clay Heuckendorf, Senior Architect for Insight. Been with Insight now for about 9 years, and my core focus is on data protection technologies.
Good morning as well. My name is Mike Mclain, Senior Architect with Insight, specializing in data protection as well. I've been with the company going on a little over 20 years. Happy to be a part of this discussion.
Perfect. So to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be discussing today, obviously data protection, we're going to take this a little bit through a ransomware and security lens here, and just note we're going to focus heavily on kind of the data protection view of ransomware. There's obviously a whole prevention side of the house that we could have another 2-hour discussion on at least. But what we really wanted to touch on today is what does the market look like from a ransomware perspective, particularly around data protection in some storage environments, and then what are some best practices really as we look to harden those devices and environments and make sure that if a breach does occur, we can restore without paying those ransoms. So, maybe we should just start off here, guys, and talk about kind of some trends that we're seeing with ransomware, particularly around these environments. It used to be kind of a smash and grab. Someone would breach, they would encrypt things, and they would send the ransom demand. And Clay, I'm interested in, from your perspective, because I know you've dealt with this quite a bit, of what we're kind of seeing today in the market around ransomware and data protection.
Yeah, and really we saw that this unique trend really started over 2 years ago, right? And to your point, I think a lot of people, it was very common to see an end user workstation get ransomed, and you didn't really see much activity after that. We got that one desktop cleaned up, and kind of the world kind of continued. But what we're starting to see now is these most malicious actors will lie in wait and try to be a little intelligent about how they're going to attack a particular environment. And one of those things they're doing, either by capturing credentials or analyzing the environment, is starting to understand where the data protection environment sits and what an organization might be doing to protect their particular workload. So, understanding that, maybe there's snapshots here, or there's another technology that's performing some streaming backups, and we're actually seeing the malicious actors go after those workloads, knowing that if they can cripple or disable or remove that component from the equation, they're much more likely to get to be paid the ransom.
No, absolutely. So Mike, kind of kicking it over to you, to Clay's point, we're seeing these be the targets, kind of the first targets, because again, if I can delete that data, delete that snapshots, encrypt that data, there's a greater chance that that organization is going to have to pay the ransom to get their data back. So, what are we seeing in the market today from different vendors to kind of mitigate or prevent these types of activities from happening?
Well, sure. One of the big key terms you're going to hear is data immutability. Basically the idea behind that is, create a storage platform where the backup data is secured and nobody can maliciously go in there and delete it, proactively. Certainly want to protect yourself not only from external threats, but internal threats as well, making sure that time clocks aren't being moved up, that backups aren't prematurely being deleted. So what we're seeing is a very much more of a security focus coming into play from our backup vendors. not only with data immutability, but introducing multi-factor authentication, best practices, putting that out there as far as just, maybe don't have admin accounts joined to the Active Directory domain, things like that, where you're just, kind of cordoning off and reducing the overall, I guess, exposure, or just the ways to get access to your backup environment.
No, absolutely. And I think we're really seeing the concept of data vaults come into play as well. A hardened location where I can store my data, and we're going to touch on a trigger word here in just a second. But really a hardened location where I can store that data, where it's protected from the outside world, and this term gets thrown around a lot. So I know Clay's very passionate about this, but we talk of air gaps back. We used to rely on air gap with tape. Tape kind of went away a little bit as cloud came into the picture, and we could use cloud as an alternative for low-cost archive. But we're starting to see air gap come back into fruition, and we're starting to see, unfortunately, that term be abused a little. So Clay, I'm gonna give you a soapbox here and let you kind of talk about really best practices around air gap and how that's kind of being manipulated in the marketing today.
Yeah, it's for me, it's definitely one of those I think overused and a term that's been, I think, redefined by almost everyone in the space, right? And really redefining it to really fit their messaging. And it's not that I have a problem with air gap. It's when we look at this from a data protection perspective, I think many of us that have been in the industry, we've always thought of no electronic path to the data, right? So historically, that has been things like tape. Where we could actually take it out of the library and put it on a shelf or send it to Iron Mountain or some other vault. And we've heard forever that tape is going away. So some of the manufacturers have started to look at how can we use some maybe disk-based technology, but then provide some sort of logical separation. I really think the term really should be more drawbridge, right? Because a lot of what they're doing is opening up some communication for a set amount of time, allowing some traffic to pass, and then shutting the door. That there's nothing wrong with that strategy, but in my mind, that's really not an air gap, right? That's more of that drawbridge mentality of we're going to have some certain parameters or things in place to make sure we're controlling that traffic, and that we know who's communicating from, say, site A to site B. We want to make sure that we understand that traffic and we have some controls about it. So, again, really, if we want to talk about it, true air gap, I think you are talking about tape again, and the other mechanisms that some of the manufacturers are starting to use. I think they're trying to fit the mold of let's check a box versus let's really have the conversation and understand what the technologies are doing.
No, absolutely, and I think it's an interesting point. Again, everybody kind of heralded the death of tape, and now we're seeing tape not necessarily make a comeback, but it's almost a tried and true method to have a separate copy of that data that we know is truly immutable and can't be modified or encrypted or infected because it physically resides somewhere else. So, we've been helping a lot of clients, kind of shore up their environments and make sure that they are ready to recover if the worst does occur. So I'm curious, what kind of strategies have we been using lately as we have these conversations? And Mike, maybe I'll kick it over to you to start.
Well, I think certainly, if you have an existing tape practice, I've seen customers continue to use it. I think the advantage of tape, certainly, as Clay mentioned, is the air gap, disconnected, offline. Nobody has access to it. But in real life scenarios, if that's your only recovery method, you realize that's going to take a long time to bring all that data back. So it's a good insurance policy to have, but not practical to restore your entire business within a 48 or 96 hour time frame normally, unless you've got a ton of drives. I think what we're seeing is backup vendors working with cloud vendors like AWS, Amazon, certainly Azure and GCP, on kind of creating like worm-based cloud storage. So you kind of get the ability to write your data out there, but the data is more just immutable and safe. So certainly the cloud costs are there, but I'm thinking that's where we're seeing more and more customers kind of take a look at that from just a cloud perspective.
No, absolutely, and I think you bring up an excellent point there. I mean, the cloud was almost kind of the easy workload to move to cloud first. Was my archive data? It's great for cheap and deep storage. You know, it did eliminate some of the hassles like tape and some of the other practices that we saw kind of pop up in data protection environments. So it was great and easy to archive to cloud, and then we start talking about restores, and that's where things get a little hairy. So, Clay, I'm curious. Cloud's great for archive. When we talk restore at scale, it starts to become a tougher conversation. How are we kind of balancing that today across different environments?
Yeah, I always go back to what are the actual requirements, right? And there's often two sets of requirements that we have to architect or really have a discussion on, right? You've got the technical requirements, which is I think a lot of us are happy to have that conversation and talk about cloud for X, Y, and Z, and maybe a different technology for A, B, and C, and really understanding what the incident response plan is for a particular event that occurs in the environment, right? So when you start looking at, something like cloud, and to your point, trying to pull back an entire environment from a cloud target may not start to hit some of the business requirements, and we may have some of the executives or C-level folks asking why it's taking so long for us to restore that data, right? So, I think, again, when we're looking at having the conversation, it really boils down to the requirements, right? If we're talking about hey, worst case, we're going to go back a week, but we're going to have everything sitting in some sort of immutable storage on-prem, and we know that we've got 40 gig, 100 gig networking, and we can get this data back. That's a much different conversation than if we've taken all of our archive data and sent it up to Amazon, and we're not ready to start standing up infrastructure in Amazon and performing the restore that incident response in the cloud, right? If we want to bring everything back, at that point, there's some simple math to be done to figure out how long it's going to take to pull back, say, even 500 terabytes or a petabyte or multiple petabytes of data to get the business up and running. Our constraint is going to be physics coming across that internet connection.
No, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's great. It's great for archive. It's great for write once, hopefully never have to read again. If strategies are DR in the cloud, absolutely makes sense to dump data there. But I think we always harp on the 3-2-1 approach, and some of that has fallen by the wayside a little bit as these newer technologies come into play. But I think it's really it's going back to our roots in the data protection discussion. It's 3 copies, 2 different locations. One of them is offsite. That's the best kind of strategy we can have from a ransomware perspective. And I think the one thing we often harp on when we talk to clients and other industry peers is really, having a test plan and having a documented test plan that you've actually tested, or having a restore plan, that you've actually tested. And so when we talk about this, Mike, I'm curious, what do we often include in these? How do we have to test differently for these types of restore scenarios than we would just kind of general files and folders from a data protection perspective?
Well, and there's different strategies I've seen customers use, whether it's just application-based testing, where you do a tabletop exercise, or actually you're recovering the entire application. But the other thing too is this concept of, if you do get hit by ransomware, chances are it's going to affect multiple applications and multiple servers in your environment. So the testing comes down to, it's not just restoring one server or one application, it's how quickly can I restore 100 of them? And so testing at that scale does get difficult, because you need a landing space, you need a isolated environment to be able to do that. So, but those are some of the things, just depending upon what the business needs are, and just your recovery point or recovery time objective really gets into how you want to design your data protection solution. The biggest thing I can recommend really is just, hopefully you've gone through kind of a business impact analysis, analyzing each one of your apps compared to what the needs are of the business, and kind of creating different tiered structures and applying your data protection best practices around that.
No, I like it. Recovery at scale, and it's something we're not really used to discussing from a data protection perspective. Is we often talk files and folders, but we don't talk about those whole environment restores. And I think the the key there is have a plan and test it. And when you're in the middle of a ransomware event, you can't start to figure out, well, what applications do I need to bring online first? What are my tier 0s, tier 1s? We have to have all of that figured out ahead of time. And the first time we run through that plan can't be in the middle of a ransomware event, because that's going to be chaotic enough. Finding holes or gaps in the plan it's not the best time to do it. So, when we look at that, kind of data classification starts to become important again. And it's things we've done in the past as we lay out these data protection strategies, but it's, again, I think with the rate data is growing and the rate applications are coming online, and now we have edge computing and we have cloud computing, and the data's kind of left the four walls of our data center and moved everywhere else in the world. Clay, I'm curious from your perspective, how are we classifying? How are we helping classify that data? What are some of our recommendations around this as we start to get that sprawl?
Yeah, so and so real quick, you had mentioned the time to figure out what we're going to do is not during an event, right? And in fact, a few weeks ago, I was asked to join a call. A client unfortunately did get hit with ransomware. Thankfully, they did have good backups, and we were able to restore some data. But we're sitting on this call, and there's about 25 people that were on this call, and we said, okay, where are we going to start? And 20 people unmuted at the same time, and we got 15 different answers from that client, right? And so they struggled with, hey, where do we start, or what needs to get up first? And I mean, they spent a good 4 hours before we started restoring data to really understand, okay, we need to start here, and here's how we're going to build things from scratch. So I can't stress enough that having a plan in place to prior to an event, it's really not a question of if, it's when. So let's make sure that we've got a solid incident response plan in place. And then to the question around classification is, we have to have a conversation with the business, right? From a technical perspective, I think a lot of us understand that these things are plugged into, switches, and there's communication, but we may not really understand how the business is using the tools and the platforms that we provided. And until we really start to have a much deeper conversation with the application owners and the business, a lot of it becomes guessing, right? So we want to make sure that we're looking at understanding, what's the maximum tolerable downtime, right? It's no longer just SLAs and RPOs and RTOs. If something went sideways, what is the absolute longest that we could be down before we're shutting down the business, right? That's a real conversation now that clients need to be having internally, so that we can, really dive in and understand that, application A is dependent on, X, Y, and Z. We need to know that before we get into it. Otherwise, again, we're wasting cycles, which really gets us closer to that maximum tolerable downtime to begin with.
No, absolutely. It's interesting. We talk a lot about recovery and having that test plan and testing that test plan. But, the other key part is being able to identify where can we restore from? What point in time can we restore from? Again, as we started the conversation today, we kind of noted it's no longer that smash and grab. It's bad actors in the environment, some waiting as long as 6 to 9 months to learn the business, learn where the key systems are, learn what can be compromised, gather those credentials. And so you figure, we normally talk about retention times, and we've heard it from a variety of different clients and peers. It's I keep a backup for 30 days, or I keep a backup maybe a month or so, and we have to really start to go back and adjust those retention times, but also really help figure out a way to detect ransomware inside the backup sets to know where we can store from. So Mike, I know you've been working a lot with a few different technologies and vendors on what they do to help identify, some of those restore points. So I'm curious if you could just talk for a couple minutes on kind of what the industry's doing to help with that issue.
No, you bet. No, it's been interesting, over the past couple of years, just seeing, where backup vendors are kind of leveraging this backup data. It's there, it's stored on an appliance. So once the data has been ingested, there's a lot of things you can do with it. You're not impacting the production data. So what we're seeing the backup vendors doing is scanning through, say it's a virtual machine backup, scanning through there, looking for ransomware, doing anomaly detection, just kind of bunch of different heuristics against it and looking and try and call out, going, hey, this incremental backup that we've been taking for the past 2 weeks is all of a sudden something's just different about it. Were a bunch of files encrypted? Did a lot of files change? And so they're doing this all in the background and then presenting a dashboard back to the client of, hey, there's possible that this machine or these machines were impacted. And they, it's been great because they'll put up, these are the last known good snapshots. Do you want to recover from them, or do you want to kind of dive into, this is the one we're kind of flagging out. You can look and see what files have changed. If anything might have been encrypted, deleted, added. So you can get a really good view at a high level of what's going on, and then be able to, respond to that, whether you want to restore 1 or 100 VMs at the same time, or, just individual files if you need to bring those back. So it's getting better all the time. More and more, vendors are adding that capability, but it's a good thing to see.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And I think as you mentioned, the key there is the intelligence that we're seeing the industry start to add on top of that data. In most cases, it is kind of a single collection point of most of the data in an environment. So the more intelligence they can place on top of that to help identify those types of activities. And again, as we mentioned, this isn't prevention. There's a whole other side of the house that's prevention, and we're not diminishing the importance there. But with the rate that the industry's changing, and as we've seen, kind of 2021, we've seen a few different attacks. Some in the supply chain that are even outside of end user control. Some in applications that have had flaws since 2013. I think this weekend was an interesting security flaw for the entire internet that we're just starting to see the impact of. So this conversation around the ability to restore and protect those restore environments becomes even more critical. Just jumping back, last thing on tests here. I know we keep beating the test drum, but it is important. But Clay, we often see clients do DR tests. I fail from one data center to the other, and I consider that a success from a business continuity perspective. How do we need to adjust that mindset to start taking in some of these ransomware restore testing activities?
Yeah, and I mean, we kind of touched on it earlier, right? So, I think from a traditional DR perspective, maybe you've got a data center A and data center B, and maybe there's some application tools that we're using to provide, a secondary copy or kind of an active type scenario. Or maybe we're leveraging things like snapshots or some other technology to make sure that we've got, say, a copy of our data every 5 minutes on the other side. And then maybe there is a traditional backup component where we're actually streaming back, say, 15 VMs or 15 workloads. When you start looking at it from a ransomware perspective, well, what if data center A and B are both compromised, right? So how do we account for, how do we, again, really in that incident response plan, if something were to go sideways, where are we going to start? Are we going to take our DR data center, initialize all the drives and volumes, and really lay down data again? Are we going to try to re-replicate? Those are things that I think a lot of organizations are struggling with that conversation, right? In the traditional DR scenario, you're assuming you've lost a data center. You had some natural disaster, you had a fire. We've been architecting, and clients have been doing this forever. That's not anything new. But when you look at something that maybe makes it into the environment or has made it into the environment and now has found its way to your secondary data center, and both get crippled at the same time, what are we doing as an organization to try to bring that data back? And that's a real conversation that our clients need to have internally, and we can help facilitate the conversation. But really trying to understand that, are we going to flip over to data center B and black dirt everything and really rebuild from scratch? Those are the scenarios that people need to start accounting for, right? It's easy to say that, yeah, we do restores, operational restores is what I call them. We do those on a daily basis. Yep, we know our data is good. Those are all great. But once you have to start restoring, say, 5,000 VMs or even 500 VMs, that's a pretty considerable task. And if we don't have the equipment or gear to do that, we may have our data, but we have no way to make it available to our end users.
No, absolutely. And I think the message we try to drive is, there's a lot of marketing out there around ransomware and around capabilities around ransomware, but I think the key here is nobody's got it fully figured out. So don't think there's a magic bullet or a magic data protection environment you can go buy and it's completely ransomware proof. I think the message we like to give is it's a constantly evolving practice. You almost have to treat it like a product internally in your environment, because the methods bad actors use are going to change, and we have to adapt with that. And so just keep in mind as we're having these discussions, we're happy to help kind of architect these solutions, but there is no magic anti-ransomware protection environment out there, unfortunately. So we did have a question come in that I want to touch on, because I think it's important to kind of complete the picture from this prevention and recovery perspective. But again, if there are questions, just feel free to throw them in the Q&A box. We're happy to get to those. But storage vendors, we touched a lot on data protection, but storage vendors are another area where we're seeing this kind of mature a little bit. And someone asked, are storage vendors working towards local undeletable snapshots? Local obviously decreases, the recovery time objective, and also measures to lock down pausing, stopping, or deleting the schedules. So I think as the industry, we are seeing more and more storage vendors kind of implement those features. There's a few out there that you can mark the snapshots undeletable, and it actually requires a two-factor key from the company support team to actually delete that snapshot before its expiration time. So, absolutely, I think the storage vendors are starting to get in on the game as well, and making sure that their data is protected and the data they're housing is protected. And absolutely, it having those snapshots does decrease the recovery time objective, but it can't be the only defense. And I think Mike, maybe touch on this a little bit, because this is a question we get quite a bit when we're talking with clients is, I do snapshots and replications on my storage environment. Why do I need protection beyond that if I'm snapping and replicating that data?
Well, and it's a great question. And, I think best practices would say that, anything can happen with that storage array. So, the idea of backing up data is getting it off of whatever that primary vendor is and putting it onto a second, or a secondary type storage, just to make sure, because something could happen with that array. It could be, corruption of any type, and then that gets replicated. So having that off that array and protected by another third-party source is generally the best way to go. One of the follow-ups just to the undeletable storage is, we're definitely seeing some vendors implement that, where you can, enable the capability that the snapshots can't be deleted even by the backup admin, and does require the two-factor capabilities where in your management sign off on it, and then I think support can come in there and help delete it. But the biggest thing there is to understand that if you make a mistake, or you choose an inadvertent backup retention, is make sure you've got the storage there to be able to handle that. Because in the end, storage backup appliances, it's a finite resource. So, we do recommend setting those. It definitely provides that protection. Just make sure you've got the space to handle that as well.
No, absolutely, and good call out. And I think a lot of that goes back to the data classification comments that Clay had. Is we need to understand, and the clients need to understand, what data is important and what data should I actually snap with those kind of undeletable technologies. Because maybe dev and QA environments, they're nice to have. I do need to get them back after an incident, but at the same time, it's not what's keeping the business running. So if something does happen to those, it's not one of those that I need immediately. But my tier 0 databases, my applications, those are ones where maybe I want to protect them. Maybe I want that extra level of protection at the storage layer. And Mike, to your point, it's really around capacity planning at that point, because those snapshots are not free, and they do stick around for a while. So if, making sure I have we have the capacity to handle those increased snapshot space. So team, I think we covered a lot today. I think really, we often talk to clients and, ask them kind of, those 3 simple questions when we're evaluating their data protection environment. Are they on up-to-date software, because that's usually the most secure? Is there an immutable and even air-gapped copy or drawbridge copy, depending on how we want to terminate, what term we want to use there? And then, do you have a plan, and have you tested that plan? So those are kind of 3 simple questions to ask yourself as you're kind of evaluating your data protection environment and shoring that up against ransomware. But I'll turn it over to you guys. Any kind of final thoughts, advice, or comments around the topic?
So, I think from my perspective, if I think back, almost a decade, a lot of times you would hear from clients, well, it's just the backup environment, right? And it was really a side portion, sometimes always forgotten about environment. Maybe it was the last one to get budget. Maybe it was, hey, we're trying to figure out, do we really need to protect this data, which is actually a good exercise to begin with. But oftentimes it was trying to avoid licensing or capacity purchases. And we touched on it earlier, but if you would ask me, 10 years ago, if having two-factor authentication in your backup environment was a thing, I would have probably laughed, right? And in today's world, we're starting to see backup applications really, it might be that ultimate safety net, which means it should be treated maybe like the ERP system within the organization, right? It really needs to be treated like a tier 1 application. So making sure that we're running latest code, making sure that we're patching it, making sure that it's not an afterthought, because if something does go sideways, and that is our safety net for the organization to literally keep the business running, we want to make sure that environment's protected.
No, absolutely. I think it was the old DR mindset. DR was there to check a box that we had it, but we didn't know its importance until the worst actually happened. So, Mike, I'll turn it over to you for any final comments here.
Just the old adage, the only good backup is one that you can restore. So just keep monitoring those, and feel free to reach out if you guys have any questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for joining me this morning. I would love to say that this topic's going to get less interesting and we can go focus on other things, but I think as we've seen, this year, and in fact this past weekend, it's going to get worse before it gets better. So, happy that we're at least getting the message out there. So again, thanks everyone for joining this morning. If you do have questions, if you'd like to schedule a follow-up or have further discussion, there is a QR code on the screen here. You can just scan that with your cell phone or tablet, and that'll bring you right to the Insight page for more information. But Clay and Mike, appreciate the time. And again, thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending today's roundtable discussion. An on-demand version of this will be available within 2 to 3 days. You will receive an email notification once the recording is available. Thank you again and have a good day.